All right. Again, welcome everybody to our Fish of the Olentangy event. So Paradise Nature Center itself is a cozy little nature center located just a mile south of Caledonia, Ohio. And so we're a new nonprofit, but we have a lot of history packed into us. So Paradise is a phrase coined by one Ray Romine, meaning heaven on earth. It's a little bit of wordplay there, which is how Ray described a newly purchased 18-acre property in 1952. So Ray was joined by his young family, which would be Trella, his wife, and her two children, David and Kathy. David currently chairs our board here at the Nature Center. Paradise was a fantastic property. It kind of took their breath away when they saw it, Ray and Trella. Trella always had this dream of living in a house on a hill in the woods by a river, and this pretty much encapsulated all of it. And if you've ever been to the property itself, you can definitely see where the house is placed, the Romine residence, right on a hill in the woods next to a river. It's everything that she had ever dreamed of. So soon after purchasing the property, Ray and Trella learned that Caledonia locals for a long time had been using the plot for easy river access, and they wanted to continue that tradition. So they kept allowing people to come in and have access to the river and have access to the natural resources that you can find on property here. Ray was a local mail carrier. He was an artist, a poet, an amateur lepidopterist, so he collected butterfly and moth species. He sadly passed away soon after the house itself was built. He only got to live in it for a year, and that left Trella to tend to not only the property, but also her two children. Trella took this challenge head on and many more. She is an accomplished naturalist and horticulturalist. She's a celebrated historian, especially here in Marion County in the state of Ohio. She was a writer and much more. So a lot of history here with Paradise. So today we continue to celebrate these two wonderful individuals with our work through the Paradise Nature Center. Here are some photos that were just taken within the last year here. We have a wide range of wildlife, a wide range of habitats. We've got towering hardwoods and seasonal pooling and a wildflower prairie. A lot of stuff packed onto this kind of small property here. So really nice to get people out here to see it. Let's see. We have a new trail system that's come in. You're welcome to get on those trails, sun up to sundown. 365 days a year. We are open. Trails are open for you to enjoy. Or you can join us every third Saturday of the month. We have a monthly bio blitz where you can come in and help us document the biodiversity that's on site here. It's as easy as coming out, taking a hike, taking a few photos of the plants and animals that you might be seeing, and then sharing those with us either through Facebook or through a really cool app called iNaturalist, which we would be happy to help you get the app and work through it and just learn all the ins and the outs of it. We would be happy to help with that. While we have everybody here right now, I want to officially invite you all to the next of the Olentangy speaker, which will be Django Grootmeyer. He will be speaking Fungi of the Olentangy, and I'm very excited for that. That's going to be on October 24th, 6 to 8. We're going to take a hike and look at some fungus. We're limiting this one to 20 people. It's going to be on site, not here at Paradise, but over at Eco Center, which is also in Caledonia. Our good friends over there, they have the best fungus in the area. So we're going to go visit their beech maple forest and hopefully find some good mushrooms, some good fungus out there. So we are excited for that. Again, October 24th, 6 to 8 p.m. So there will be more information on that coming up very soon. So without delaying any longer, I'd like to thank Ethan Simmons, a Region 1 fish biologist with the ODNR, for logging on with us today. And are you ready?
I think so.
All right. Well, we certainly appreciate you. I will hand it off to you from here.
So I'm sitting outside. Hopefully my dogs or neighbors' dogs don't start barking like crazy. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I would have enjoyed being in a river instead of sitting at home. But given our current circumstances, we're not really allowed to be out and about too much. So this is the next best thing. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. As Tyler mentioned, my name's Ethan Simmons. I'm a fisheries biologist at our District 1 office here in Columbus for the Ohio Division of Wildlife. So I am down in Columbus, also on the lower Olentangy River, not too far. I live in Clintonville, so not far from the Olentangy. So tonight I'm going to talk to you guys about fishes of the Olentangy River. So just to give you a brief outline of where I'm going to go with this presentation, just briefly I want to tell you a little bit about ODNR and the Division of Wildlife that I work for. Then we'll talk a little bit about aquatic habitats, because you can't have fish without habitat. And then we'll talk about watersheds, more specifically on river habitats. And then if you want to explore fish in the future, some tools to help you learn fish. And then, assuming I have time, we'll talk about fishes of the upper Olentangy River. And then I'm just going to focus on these different species, not species of fish, but different groups of fish. There are more, but I don't have time to cover them all. So real quickly, I work for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, which is a cabinet level position in the state of Ohio. So our director works directly for the governor. We were established in 1949. We currently have 11 divisions. You can see listed on the screen all the different divisions. Most people are probably familiar with like Division of Parks, which now became Parks and Watercraft. But I work for the Division of Wildlife. So we are actually older than the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. We were established in 1873 as the Ohio Fish Commission. And then later on, we took on more responsibility to manage also the wildlife. So our job is to conserve and improve fish and wildlife resources for all Ohioans. And we do this mainly through hunting and fishing license sales. So that's how we get most of our money. We also have some other incomes, but that's basically where we get funded. So if you bought a hunting or fishing license, then thank you. You helped pay for this presentation. So just jumping into it, you know, we're going to talk about fish tonight, and fish need a place to live, and they have a lot of variety of habitats that they can live in. And we're talking inland waters. We're not going to be talking about oceans today. We're talking freshwater inland waters. So when you think about aquatic habitats, a lot of people likely think about a pond. And so an image of a pond might come to mind, like this is one at a housing development or maybe a farm pond, but ponds are small, relatively small, typically shallow environments. You might think of something bigger like a lake. So this is a picture of a nice picturesque northern lake, typically a little bit deeper, maybe a little less nutrient rich than a pond. In Ohio, we actually don't have many lakes. Most of our, what we call a lake, are actually reservoirs. A reservoir is something that if you took a stream and plopped a big dam like this one at Alum Creek on that river, and then you can see on the left-hand side of the screen the resulting lake that forms, and it kind of looks like a big river. So we don't really have lakes per se that are natural. We have a few in Ohio, but most of what we have are ponds, rivers, streams, and reservoirs. We also have some habitat called wetlands. So wetlands are kind of like a pond, but a little bit shallower, typically associated with a river system where things get flooded, maybe a seasonal wetland where it's wet in the spring and then it dries up a little bit. But these are really important for different kinds of species to live in. And then what we'll be talking today about is rivers and streams. So this is probably what you think of when you think of a typical river or stream: more flowing system, more flowing water, more rocks, more woody debris. So I bring all these things up because, you know, different fish live in these different habitats. And so the specific species of fish that we talk about may be suited for these particular habitats. So the species of fish that we are going to talk about tonight are mostly suited to live in these flowing river systems. They're not really species that live in the stagnant water of a wetland, or they may be suited to live in a reservoir because that's kind of a hybrid of a river and a lake. But they have all adapted over time to live in these different environments. And so we'll go over some of the species and some of their adaptations to live in these kind of flowing dynamic systems. So to talk about different river systems, we generally talk about them as watersheds. And so this is an image of Ohio with all the major river systems in it. So you can see in Ohio, we have a lot of different rivers running throughout the state. And when we talk about a watershed, that's something where it's defined as an area or a ridge of land that separates waters flowing to different rivers or basins. So you can see in this picture, there's a big dark line towards the northern portion of Ohio. That's actually the Lake Erie watershed line. So water north of that line or above that line goes into Lake Erie, and water below that line runs into the Ohio River. So where I'm at in Columbus, in the middle, our water drains down into the Ohio River. So I'm in the Ohio River watershed. And you can break these things down even into smaller groups. So if you break it down into the Scioto River watershed, it's a major part of Ohio, but a much smaller portion than the Ohio River watershed. So this is an image showing all of the streams that drain into the Scioto River and make the main stem of the Scioto River, which is actually the largest watershed in Ohio. And if we break it even further, we can get into the Olentangy River watershed. So here's an image. It starts up in Crawford County, flows through Marion. You can see, if you can hopefully see the green dot on the screen, is the Paradise Nature Center. So where I would have been had we not been in a pandemic. And then it flows through Delaware Lake, down into Delaware County, and then into Franklin County, where I am currently at. So any water that flows into these streams eventually ends in the Scioto River down at the bottom in Franklin County. And just to highlight it a little bit more, so all the water that lands in this green area would end up in the Olentangy River and provide habitat for the fishes we're going to talk about. And as I was thinking about what to talk about for this presentation, I just Googled a little bit of history on the Olentangy River itself, and I thought this was kind of interesting. The Olentangy was actually originally called Whetstone Creek, which there is still a Whetstone Creek in the watershed, but not the main stem. It's now called the Olentangy. And the reason they called it Whetstone Creek was actually because the Native Americans used the shale to make knives, and the settlers thought that stone for your knife meant like a sharpening stone or a whetstone. They misunderstood that that was actually like their stone to make a knife, because they used primitive knives. And so it was actually originally called whetstone. But then in the 1830s, James Kilbourne, which is founded Worthington, Ohio, which is just north of me, he wanted to rename a lot of these streams in Ohio after Native Americans. And somehow Whetstone Creek ended up being named Olentangy River, which is kind of funny because the Big Darby Creek, which is just a little west of me, was actually should have been named the Olentangy River, but somehow the Olentangy is now the Olentangy, and Darby is named after some Native American guy that lived on the Darby named Darby. So just a little bit of history of naming the river, which is kind of funny. The Scioto River, which we drain into, I think that means something about a buck's eye, something to that effect. All right, so we talked about, in general, freshwater aquatic habitats, but more specifically, let's talk about river habitats, because that's what we're talking about today. So if you look at a river spatially, like, so if you think about this map starting in the headwaters of Crawford County, running through Marion County, down into Delaware, into Franklin, You can kind of think of that of it as the headwaters kind of turning into a small stream, turning into a medium stream, and then ending in a larger river system. And within that river system, you have different kind of micro habitats, I guess, where I'll talk about a riffle, which is swift water, kind of shallow, running over rocks, kind of like very shallow, aerated, swifter currents. A run current, which is flowing water with some flow, but not as rapid as a riffle, and you don't necessarily see the rocks. It kind of looks more of like a pool, and then the pool habitat, which is kind of more like what you would think of as a pond or less flow. So different fishes are designed to live in different parts of these habitats, and different fishes prefer to live in different sections of a river. So talking about a headwater would look something like this. So this is a very small stream, often intermittent, or they dry up during the summer because they don't have a lot of flow coming to them. And there's probably not a lot of species of fish that will live in this because it does dry up and they would have to evacuate. But they are important seasonally in spring when fishes are spawning. And then they're also almost act as like a wetland in helping the downstream river, cleaning up the water and such. Unfortunately, a lot of what we see of headwater streams looks like this nowadays, with tile drainage for farming to help improve farming, which is great to grow crops in, but not so great for headwater stream habitat. So a lot of what our headwaters look like is this, which is just a straight line with some drainage tile. But as you move downstream, the river might start looking more like this, where it's pretty small, still maybe a little intermittent in the summer, but mostly flowing year-round. Some shallow pool, but there's some riffles you can kind of see in the upper middle of the screen. And then that'll turn into something like this, where it's a medium-sized river, where you can kind of see overhanging branches. It's much wider, but still not really wide. You can see riffles and runs, different habitat forming. And then, of course, this is not the Olentangy, this is the Scioto River, but the Olentangy gets pretty wide at its base and becomes a large river. And so the fish that live in this system are going to be very different from the fish that live in that small stream system. So the different habitats dictate what fishes we're going to find, which I guess is that slide. So now that I've talked about where fishes live, let's talk about the actual fish. So in the Olentangy River, in the watershed itself, there are 76 species of fish that live in the whole entire watershed. And just to give you some kind of context, there's 170 species, or roughly 170 species in the state of Ohio. So a pretty fair number of fish live in the watershed. But today we'll just talk about fish in Marion County, and there's 56 species in Marion County. So what that tells you is 20 of these species likely are fishes that live in big river systems, not in these smaller river systems that you find in Marion County. And just to get specific, there are 11 species of sportfish, 6 species of suckers, 20 species of minnows, 8 darters, and then I'll talk a little bit about some interesting species that didn't really fit in the categories. And there are other species of fish, and I'm not going to talk about all of these because that would just be overwhelming. But there are other species of fish that live in there, and total is 56 in Marion County. So if you guys are interested in fish beyond this presentation, if I haven't bored you to death, and you get inspired to learn more, there are some good resources out there to learn on your own and to use if you want to do this on your own time or to help in a class or something like that. Unfortunately, the best one was our website, which was free and easily accessible from a phone, but that recently was hacked and we had to redo our entire website, so it's under construction. So once that's back up, hopefully within a few months, we'll have all of the Fishes of Ohio back on our website, and that'll be a good resource to use. But in the interim, we do still have these on the right-hand side. You can see the Stream Fishes of Ohio Field Guide and the Sportfish of Ohio Field Guide. These are free. You know, if you want these, you can email me and I can have them shipped out to you. The Stream Fishes is really good. It has really good distribution maps, really good pictures, really great, but it's a little bit limited. It doesn't have all the fish in Ohio. The Sportfish one is all of your common fish that you would come across and some tips on fishing. So that's good for fishing. The kind of ultimate book, if you really want to learn more about fishes, is the Fishes Naturalist Guide to the Fishes of Ohio book. It recently came out maybe a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. It's a really up to date. It has really great maps. It has every fish in Ohio, and it's relatively inexpensive. It's about $27, I think, to buy online. So a really great resource if you want to get into this more. And then if you do want to learn more about fish, I'm lucky in that we have specialized tools to catch fish. So it's pretty easy for us, but for the average person, it may be difficult to go catch a fish. You know, these things are underwater, you can't really see them. But the easiest way to go out and catch a fish to observe it is simply just fishing for it. That's the most fun too. So going fishing, you're going to catch a lot of these bigger sport fish generally. But there are a lot of species I'll talk about that are much smaller that you wouldn't be able to catch on hook and line. So some people have taken to microfishing. This is kind of a newer thing where people use really, really tiny hooks to catch tiny fish. And it's not about the sport of catching the fish, it's about the diversity of fish you catch. So it's almost like a birder going out and trying to see the most birds they can, you know, in a lifetime. This is the same thing for fishermen, trying to catch the most diversity of fishes you can catch. So you could set up a little rod and catch some microfish. Another way, you could try dip nets. This isn't the best way to catch fish in a river habitat, more in a wetland habitat. This would work where they're relating to vegetation. This could work quite well. And then, of course, a seine is something you can pull through a river. This is a typical way that a lot of people will catch fish in a river. This is a net that two people hold on each side. It's got a lead on the bottom and a float on the top. And you'll wrap fish around and be able to capture them and look at them. There are some rules in Ohio about the size of seine you can use. So you do keep that in mind if you go out. You can also use a cast net. This is a kind of a similar to a seine, but a different style of net that you throw out and it sinks and catches fish. This takes a lot of coordination and learning how to use it, but it can be quite fun. A lot of catfishermen will use this to catch their bait. And then if you don't have a net, you can always go and just swim, scuba dive, like in the river, and just observe fish in their natural habitat. And this can be fun because you see them acting more natural versus being in a net, like flopping around. And then if you don't want to get in the water, just simply observing from the shore and getting a pair of good polarized sunglasses is helpful. Polarized sunglasses actually block the glare of the sunlight on the top of the water, and it helps you to see further down into the water. So you could just stand on a maybe a taller shore and view into the river and watch fish swimming around. So those are kind of tools and things to help you learn if you want to go further with this. So now that I have talked about all that stuff, let's talk about some fish. So when I talk about fish, they have different features to help them identify the species of fish. I won't talk too much about fish ID, more just about like where the fish live and some of the different species. But if you do want to identify a fish you don't know what it is, there's things to look at on a fish. So the most obvious thing is going to be its size and length. So if it's a big fish, it kind of eliminates a lot of species that it could be, because most minnows don't get very big. You know, it's limited to certain things. So the size and length of fish, the shape of the body is important to pay attention to, the size and placement of the mouth. So this largemouth bass has a mouth kind of at the end of its face. Some species will have one at the bottom, some will have a little upturn, so looking at its mouth is important. Does it have whiskers? So like catfish are common fish everybody knows have what they call barbels or whiskers. Another thing a catfish has is a fleshy fin called an adipose fin. The bass doesn't have it, but if it has an adipose fin, that helps you determine what kind of species of fish it is. This anal fin shape and the number of rays in it is important on certain fish. The dorsal fin shape and spine. So all these different things. And then kind of lastly is your color patterns. That can be kind of deceiving because fish kind of can change their colors depending on their environment. So not always is that a good one to identify off of, but it's definitely helpful. So when you're identifying a fish, these are all things you want to kind of keep in mind and look at to help identify them. So to start out with, I just wanted to go over sportfish because these would be your most typical ones you would come across because they're things people fish for and kind of your easiest to catch and see. So largemouth bass, hopefully everybody knows what a largemouth bass is. They are pretty much everywhere in Ohio. We stock them as a sport fish in ponds, and so they basically escape and end up in our rivers. So they're not really a river species, more of a big river species they would prefer, but not a smaller river like up in the upper portions of the Olentangy. But because they're stocked everywhere, they're just everywhere. They really prefer a slower moving, like weedy, woody habitat than a river system. But as you can see, they get quite large. They're not going to be like that in Caledonia, but they do get that big. And if you were going to go fishing for them, you really, like a spinnerbait is a good bait or anything that imitates a fish. This is the smallmouth bass. This is kind of the top dog when it comes to small streams. This is the top predator in our smaller river systems, and really the #1 sport fish when it comes to river fishing. So this is really, if you wanted to go fishing in a river, this is typically what you're targeting. And these guys are much different than a largemouth in that they prefer the swifter currents and more rocky habitats. And then they, of course, have a smaller mouth, hence the name, than a largemouth. And so they eat smaller creatures in the river. Typically, crayfish is their favorite food to eat, but they'll eat fish and other aquatic insects. But if you were going to fish for these guys, you really want to use a tube jig or some kind of crayfish imitating bait. That's really what they like to eat. And so just to compare, the largemouth, is a green fish. The smallmouth is a brown fish or bronze colored fish. So, and then their mouth is much smaller when you're looking at them. But these are really the creme de la creme, I guess, when you go fishing. Another fish that you're going to catch if you go out fishing in the Olentangy in the upper portions especially is a rock bass. So these guys are related to a smallmouth and largemouth, but they're more of a sunfish than a bass, even though they're called a rock bass. But they're much smaller. You can see that's a typical size one in the lower corner there, but they do get bigger. But these guys are really like ambush predators. They like to sit behind a rock, jump out like next to current, and something drifts through, and they'll jump out and grab it and then go back under their rock. And so they're kind of easy to catch, so they can be fun, especially for younger fishermen, because they can be plentiful and easy to catch. You can see the one on the lower picture has a bright red eye. That's kind of an indicator of a rock bass. And then another species maybe people are familiar with and kind of everywhere are the channel catfish. And channel catfish, we stock them in ponds and reservoirs and all over the place, but they really are kind of river fish. They prefer the deeper water, woody debris. They generally stay in those pool habitats, but when they're feeding, they really can be found in really shallow water. They eat a wide variety of things. So if you do go fishing for them, people use stinky things like night crawlers or shrimp or stinky baits. But they'll eat anything. So even spinner baits or all kinds of different varieties of baits, you can catch them. And just to note, when you catch a channel catfish, some people think their barbels or their whiskers are poisonous, but they're not. It's their dorsal and pectoral fins that are spines. They're almost like a needle, and they can poke you, and they're really kind of dangerous. So you have to be careful when handling channel catfish. And then the last sport fish I'm going to talk about is the common carp. Some people don't consider this a sport fish, but they are pretty sporting when you catch them. They can fight really hard, and they're pretty much everywhere. They're actually a non-native fish, so they are not normally in Ohio. We, as a federal government, stocked them in the late 1800s all over the place because we had kind of ruined our native fishes. And so now they're pretty much everywhere. They're super smart and highly adaptive. They're kind of can be hard to catch because they're so smart. But most of the fish around here, they're not so hard to catch because they're so plentiful, and not many people fish for them. But they are a great fish to fish for. But these are kind of like largemouth bass in that they're nearly everywhere in all habitats, not just river habitats. So that's my quick rundown on sport fish. Of course, I mentioned there were 11 sport fish in the system. I only talked about a few, but I don't have time to go over them all. But let's talk more about species that maybe you've never seen before because they're not a species that you catch on hook and line generally. So let's talk about suckers. This is one of my favorite sucker species. This is the northern hog sucker. You can see from that funny face in the lower picture why it's one of my favorites. It's just a unique looking kind of cool fish. It's got those really funny protruding lips, which is indicative of all sucker species. But these guys have really, these vacuum lips on them. Pretty funny. These guys are actually designed to live in a riffle type habitat, shallow, swift water. Their bodies are actually, if you can see in the lower picture, the head is actually concave a little bit, and it's designed to have water push their heads downward, and they don't have an air bladder in their body, so they don't float up like some fish float up. And then they have these specialized pectoral fins that are almost like giant suction cups that they can hold tight to the bottom of the river. So the body, their adaptations with their fins, and then of course the coloration, you can see they look like a gravel bar. They blend in perfectly with a gravel, which you would find in a riffle type habitat. So they're kind of a perfect species for a river system, and a really cool one. And they can get fairly big, maybe 14, 18 inches at most, but a fairly good sized fish. This sucker is the white sucker. This is kind of the most common species, one of the most common species in Ohio overall. These guys are very tolerant and adaptive to many different habitats. They don't really have the specialized body like the hogsucker does, but they're similar. You can see in the bottom corner, their lips protrude out too, maybe not quite as far as the hogsucker. But they're kind of generalists, and really they can be pretty much anywhere, but you'll often find them in the smaller rivers, smaller headwater streams in just super abundance. Kind of a cooler sucker species, the last sucker I'll talk about is called a red horse sucker. And this is a golden red horse. This is the most common of the different red horse species. We have, I want to say 7 species of red horse, I think. And this is the most common one and kind of one of the smaller ones. But these guys are actually opposite of the white sucker in that they are indicators of good water quality. You kind of need special habitat for them to survive and to eat and to spawn. So it's good to find these in your river system, and these are plentiful in the Olentangy. Historically, these would have probably been your most abundant species in these in our river systems. The red horses would have been really, I mean, you'll see them schooled up in just huge schools. And historically, this is probably what a lot of the Native Americans would have eaten because they were just the most plentiful fish to eat. Nowadays, we don't really fish for them because they're kind of hard to catch with the small mouths, and you have to have small hooks and live bait. But if you do catch them, they are very fun to catch. They're quite sporting to catch. So moving on, I'll talk about the minnows of the Olentangy. So just to freak you out, here is 5 different minnows that basically look identical. So I'm not going to talk too much about the 20 different species of minnows because it would get pretty boring. You know, they all are pretty tiny, a few inches long. They all look kind of shiny, all kind of look the same. They can be quite difficult to differentiate, even for people that know about different species of minnows. But these are 5 different species that you would find in the Upper Olentangy, pretty common. I guess one thing to note, the silver jaw minnow is kind of cool because you can see the name where it came from. That silver jaw, that pattern under its eyeball is kind of neat. So some more unique minnows I'll talk about, the creek chub. So this guy is kind of the king of the castle when it comes to really tiny streams. So if you're going to fish some of the tributaries probably of the Olentangy, you would come across the creek chub. In the lower portion, that's me years ago with a giant creek chub. That one's really big from the Mad River. They don't get generally that big often, but they do. But you can see they have a really big mouth for their body. They kind of look like a little mini trout. So these guys are actually the top predator in a lot of these small streams that don't have smallmouth bass in them or rock bass. So they're kind of a cool fish. You can catch them on hook and line. And they're kind of neat. They're really plentiful. They prefer like living under undercut banks, so where the water has cut under the side of the stream, and they can provide shade and cover for them, and like living in deep holes. But these guys are not really specialized in anything. They're more omnivorous, so they eat anything that they can fit in their mouth. Very, very plentiful. This is actually the most common species of fish in the state of Ohio. And then the last minnow I'm going to talk about is the central stone roller. And this one is quite common, kind of lives in a similar habitat to our the hogsucker that we talked about. You can kind of see they have a similar color pattern as the hogsucker to blend in with that shallow gravelly area. But these guys are interesting because they have these specialized mouths. You can see in the lower picture, they have this horseshoe-shaped mouth, and they kind of have a special ridge that is designed to help scrape algae off of rocks. And so that's kind of where they got the name from the stone roller. You can see them in the shallows picking around on the algae on rocks, and so it kind of looked like they were rolling stones while they were feeding. So kind of a cool fish. Interesting little mouth, but they're very small, but quite common. You would catch them in seines if you ever seine in a riffle area. So now for kind of the fancy fish of the Olentangy, the darters. So these are a pretty neat family of fish. So this is kind of the prettier of the darter species, the rainbow darter. These guys are kind of similar to a minnow in their size, but they're not a minnow. They're actually related to a walleye, if you know what that is, the fish up on Lake Erie that people fish for. They're in the same family as a walleye or a perch. But these guys are specialized fishes that live mostly in swift currents. So they, similar to the hogsucker, don't have the air bladder. You can see they have very big pectoral fins that they can use to grip onto rocks, designed to be in that swift water. This is a male rainbow darter. The females don't get quite as colorful, but really, I mean, almost looks like a tropical fish. Really cool. But these guys are pretty common. Rainbow darters are pretty common. You can see the size relative to the hand in the bottom there. Really a neat fish. And then here's 3 other darters. The fantail darter, all these guys kind of live in similar habitats. You would come across them in similar habitats. There are a few darters that live in pool habitats. I didn't include them in this presentation, but log perch darter is one that would live in a pool. But most of the darters like to live in the shallow riffle habitats. But the fantail darter, not nearly as colorful as the other two, the green side and the banded, but kind of a neat, you can see the dorsal fin is really unique. It's kind of got those little knobs on the top of the spine. It's kind of cool looking. And then of course the name comes from the design of its tail, the design on its tail. And then the green side and the banded darter, I think, are just some of the more cool looking fish. I always thought the green side looked like a Kermit the Frog fish. He kind of has funny cheeks that pop out, kind of look like a Kermit fish. And they're a little bit bigger of the different species. I don't have one showing size, but they could be probably up to maybe 6 inches. They can get a little bit bigger than the banded and the fantail and rainbow. So these guys are really cool, just in that, you know, they're really pretty and kind of neat to watch dart around. They get their names, of course, by their actions in that shallow water, like darting from rock to rock, going after insects to eat. And so the last thing I'm going to talk about is kind of some fish that didn't really fit in a category, but I wanted to talk about them because they're neat. The first one is the grass pickerel. So grass pickerel are pretty common in our smaller streams. These are kind of like little mini pike. They don't get much bigger than maybe 10 or 12 inches, but they act like little mini pike. If anybody knows what a pike is, they get quite big and are voracious feeders. But these guys don't get much bigger than 10, 12 inches, but they act like a pike, so it's kind of funny. They favor really shallow like grassy habitats. They're really common like in our plains areas, like the Big Darby Creek has a lot of slow moving grassy areas in the river. An area with a lot of grass pickerel would also be Killbuck Creek, so marshy type system. So probably not as common in the Olentangy, but they would be up there. But a really neat fish. They actually, if you catch one and you keep them in an aquarium, they can be quite fun to watch because they just are crazy at chasing down other fish that you feed them. And then one of my favorite fish, other than the hogsucker, is the Stonecat Madtom. And this one, you really don't see these very often at all because they're very secretive. But this guy is kind of this miniature catfish. That is a pretty good size one in the bottom of the picture there. But these guys are awesome because they actually, all the Madtoms, there's a variety of Madtoms in Ohio. They all have poison in their pectoral spines. So I talked about channel catfish. You know, they don't have a poison. They don't have anything in their pectoral spines they hurt. But the Madtoms actually do have a poison gland in their pectoral spine. So if they poke you, it's like getting stung by a bee. So kind of cool, a good deterrent for a predator. But these guys are very secretive. They hang out under big flat rocks in riffly type habitats. So you don't really see them very often. But if you do, if you seine for darters, you might come across a stone cat. So you do want to be careful when you handle them so you don't get poked by them. But really a neat looking fun fish, and also can make a good aquarium pet. So that's really all I'm going to talk about today. I know I said we have 56 species of fish in the Upper Olentangy, but I didn't want to bore you guys to death. Hopefully you guys learned something. I hope you know, if we do this again, we can actually do it in person and catch some of these fish. But hopefully this helped inspire a few people to maybe get out and explore. It's a great time, obviously, to keep your distance and go out into a river and enjoy the river and hopefully catch some fish. So with that, I will take any questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, Ethan, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I know I definitely have some questions, but I want to first open it up to our Zoom call members here. And then if you want to put questions in the chat, that's totally fine. I'll patrol that there. Or if you want to unmute and ask some questions, I'm open to that as well. And then I'll be on the Facebook comments, patrolling there for any questions. But let's start with our Zoom callers here. So Heather asks, do rosy red minnows naturally live in the Olentangy watershed?
Yeah, so those are a native fish. Is that what you mean by naturally live? That would be a native fish in, well, you mean the redfin minnow that I showed, or rosy, I guess?
So we have an interesting situation. We put some minnows from the pet store, the kind that they sell for feeder fish,
Oh, those,
in
yeah.
our swimming pool. No, they're not natural. So we put them in our swimming pool because we wanted to control mosquitoes, and they worked for that. And then they multiplied, and so we're like, okay, so who wants rosy red minnows? And we're trying to figure out if we can give them to people who, would have ponds that would go, into the watershed. We don't want to like put non-native species into
Yeah, sure.
areas that they shouldn't be.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, you could give them to someone with a pond. They would just get eaten very
Okay.
quickly by a bass or a bluegill.
We wouldn't have to worry
They
about
may
them taking
even
over the
sell
world.
those. They may even sell those like in for feeding fish. So no, that's not something you would want to release into the Olentangy River. But if you keep them in a closed system, it shouldn't be a problem. I mean, I guess I wouldn't make a habit of trying to stock those into ponds, but it shouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
That's a good question. And I appreciate that you're conscious of not releasing non-natives into our rivers.
Yeah, I don't want them to take over the world. I just don't want to have to put them in my garden either. So.
Yeah, I'm not terribly familiar with those. They may die in the winter time. They may not, they may not be a tropical fish, but maybe not a overwintering fish either. I'm not sure. I'm not too familiar with that species. So that, that we're lucky in Ohio because a lot of people that have aquarium fish that release them are generally warm water fish that just die in the winter. So if someone releases their piranha into Ohio waters, it lives for a summer and then is dead. So we're lucky, somewhere like Florida, any aquarium fish that gets released can live. And so they have a lot of problems with invasive species from aquariums.
Fantastic. So Jess asks, does the hook hurt the fish?
No, not really. I mean, it depends, I guess, on where the hook lands on the fish. So when you're fishing, you try and be sporting. You don't want to try and hook them deep, or you match your equipment to the fish you're fishing for. But if the fish just catches it in its mouth, which is what you hope to do, it penetrates its mouth, and then you pull it out and let it go. So there are when you're fishing, there are fish handling practices. You want to wet your hands when you catch a fish to help protect their slime coat. You don't want to keep them out of the water for very long, obviously because they need to breathe in water. So there's things you can do to minimize your impact to the fish when you're unhooking them. But no, the hook, as long as it's not swallowed, if it does swallow it, then you just generally try and cut the hook and hope that the hook dissolves over time and that the fish can still swallow. So that's really the only time a hook would be harmful, is if it really got deep into its body or maybe caught its gill or something. Good question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jess would also like to know how you categorize a sport fish.
So a sportfish is a fish that we would go out and try and capture with a hook and line. And then those fish are generally more of our species of fish that provide a really fun catch. So when you're reeling them in, they, like a smallmouth bass, is very what they call sporting because it jumps out of the water and provides a lot of tugging on the line, and it's kind of fun to reel in. It exciting because you may not get it in because it's fighting so hard and it will break loose or get away from you. So fish that fight hard are voracious feeders. So ones that you can use special lures to catch them with and provide a good fight are considered sport fish. So there's about 22 species of fish in Ohio that we consider sport fish. And then the remainder of those 170 or the 150 or whatever would be non-sport fish, because either they're so small they wouldn't provide a fight, or they're hard to catch because of the way they eat. You know, you don't have a lure to catch them with, that kind of thing.
Yeah. All right. So Wanda would like to know about flying fish. Are there any flying fish in Ohio?
No, hopefully not. I guess technically on the southern portion of the Ohio River, we do have the Asian carp. So silver carp do jump out of the water and kind of fly when motorboats are running. If anybody's seen the videos of them, they can be quite dangerous, actually. We're trying to keep those at bay as best as we can. But that would be the only semi-flying fish that we would have.
And there's lots of effort going in to mitigate that situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. I think, let's see. Oh, so Bill would like to know about any gar in the Olentangy.
I don't think there are any in the upper Olentangy. There may be, but definitely in the lower Olentangy, there are long-nosed gar. So they are quite common, like in our kind of the bigger, medium to bigger river systems. So the Scioto River is chock full of them. Hoover Reservoir, if you wanted to go gar fishing, is a great place to fish for them. It's one of the only lakes that has gar in it. I don't think there's any in Delaware Reservoir, but downstream, you'll definitely find them. They're a really cool fish. I didn't include them because we were talking about the upper Olentangy, but they're really prehistoric, neat-looking fish. Can be found sunbathing a lot in the pools of rivers. So a fun one to watch. If you get those polarized shades, you can watch them just hanging out during the day, and then at night or low light, they'll go and feed on fishes. Really a neat fish. That's another one of my favorite fish.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting fish. Do you think that might be your favorite fish, Ethan? This is one of my questions. What is your favorite fish?
I think my favorite fish is probably a flathead catfish. So those I didn't talk about because they're kind of a big river fish. But they're in the lower section of the Olentangy. But they can get quite large, 50, 60 pounds. And they can fit basically anything that swims in their mouth. So they're like the lions of the river. So they basically are just, I mean, they're untouchable. Nothing can eat them, and they can eat everything. So they're kind of like the coolest. And they look really cool. So flathead catfish is my favorite.
That's awesome. Do you get to do any traditional fishing with your job at the DNR? We talked about all those cool fishing strategies that you get to use, and then definitely have discussed electrofishing. But do you get to rod and reel it at all?
Not for my job, but I do that in my, in my off time.
Awesome. Yeah.
So no, we don't. There are times that using angling is the best way to catch a fish. But in Ohio, we don't generally need that because things are pretty accessible. That may be something like if you were doing a research project in some remote area and just couldn't get your equipment there, it would probably be the easiest to go just fish for them. But in Ohio, we're pretty lucky we can get places. And I mean, I guess I'm unlucky in that way because I would love to just fish for my job, but
yeah,
we don't get to do that.
Yeah, I hear that for sure. Maybe to kind of shift it in a different direction, Ethan, what is your, I guess, current largest concern for fish in Ohio?
I guess just like habitat changes. So the changes that we're I show you, you know, that drainage problems that we're having. They call it improved drainage for farming, but it's not so improved for fish. All that drainage that goes into the upper portions of our watersheds creates really flashy habitats in our river systems. So what happens is that water, instead of slowly trickling through the farm fields and slowly getting into the rivers, just gets to the river instantly, flashes, you know, really, really high water for a couple of days and then dissipates, and doesn't provide any like long-term water to the system because it all just leaves so quickly. And so that can be, you know, harmful to the fishes because, you know, they're living in this really swift water for a day or two and then it dissipates and can be disruptive for them. So habitat in that regard, and then also just, you know, the landscape changes of more suburbanization, I guess, would be problematic for our fishes. So that's probably the one of the major concerns, and we don't have a lot that we can do about it because it's such a big scale. It's on such a large scale.
Yeah, for sure. So in contrast, Jess in the chat here is asking for a success story. Is there any species that has really just kind of bloomed in the last couple of years, or maybe a conservation program that's really successful for you right now?
Yeah, so we have started funding some research projects and reintroduction of certain species in Ohio. So one of the examples is the blue breast darter. So it's a variety of the darters that I showed you. They have actually come back considerably from not extinction, but they were I think they were threatened or endangered. I can't remember recently, and they recently come off of the threatened and endangered list because they are so plentiful. And then we've actually we work with a gentleman called Brian. His name's Brian Zimmerman, who he provided a lot of those pictures that I showed, and he was the author in the book that I mentioned. He is working to reintroduce those in areas that don't have a natural population to repopulate. So once that habitat has improved in certain systems, I mean, so I mentioned habitat degradation as a problem, but over time, I mean, habitat has improved because we've improved water quality by limiting pollution from point sources. So like, you know, a pipe coming out that is a pollutant, providing pollutant. We've done a good job since the 70s of cleaning that kind of thing up. So habitat has improved, the water quality has improved, and a fish like the blue breast has come back. But it's still, like, on a broad scale, habitat is still a problem. But anyways, blue breast is another one. The Tippecanoe darter is another one that's come back. Spotted darter. So a lot of these different darter species that had kind of gone away have come back strong.
Excellent. Very good. I think I've got one more question here for you. This is from Bill as well. So are trout only in Mad River in Clear Creek, or where else can you find them?
So inland streams with trout is, yes, the Mad River and Clear Creek in Hocking and Fairfield County, but also Clear Fork in Richland and Ashland County. Clear Fork of the Mohican has inland trout. And then, of course, we have steelhead up on Lake Erie in the tributaries near Cleveland. But those are only trout waters. So the Mad River is brown trout. Clear Creek now is actually rainbow trout. And Clear Fork is brown trout above Pleasant Hill Lake and rainbow trout below Pleasant Hill Lake. And those fish will be stocked probably next month.
Awesome. Do you, Ethan, partake in the steelhead run?
The few times I've done it, I didn't catch anything, and it was a really long drive, so I haven't done it for a while.
Yeah. Probably pretty cold too, huh?
Yeah, but that you can dress appropriately.
Yeah.
I've actually wanted to get up there, oddly enough, and go sucker fishing. The white suckers, which I mentioned, make a huge run the same time the steelhead run up, and you can catch tons of big suckers. And I've wanted to catch them and keep them and pickle them. Try a pickled sucker recipe, but I just have not done it.
Yeah, that sounds awesome, actually.
They're actually supposed to be pretty good, but the bones, they're really bony. You know, they're really nice white meat, but they're really bony. So the pickling is supposed to dissolve those small bones and make them more palatable.
Oh, that makes
Well,
sense.
not palatable, but more edible, I guess.
Right, right. Yeah, you'll have to share that recipe with me.
Yeah.
Well, excellent. I think from this point, it kind of seems like a wrap, so we can go ahead and package this one up nicely here. Ethan, can you remind everybody where we can find those ODNR field guides?
Yeah, so you can actually download the field guides on our website. That is actually available on our website. So if you use the search engine, I guess I didn't put that on our website, is wildohio.gov. If you use the search feature on our website and just type in field guides, it'll bring up, we have a ton of them. I think like almost 20 field guides, from moths to lichens to birds, the 2 fishes that I showed, and those are all available on our website. And if you want hard copies, you can just email me and I'll forward the information to our warehouse, and we can send them to people. And then hopefully we'll have our website with the fishes information up soon. But if anybody has been to our website recently, it's kind of it's new, it's all new and kind of bare bones. We're working on it.
Yeah, for sure. And those field guides, I mean, even at the Nature Center here, we use them all the time. I mean, all the time.
Yeah, they're really,
just
really
fantastic.
great. Yeah, they're great.
Great photos in there, especially for moths and butterflies. I mean, they're just fantastic. Yeah, so perfect. Well, Ethan, I know that you are a busy guy and you're doing a lot of good work for ODNR out there and for the state of Ohio. So we can't thank you enough for joining us here and taking the time to put together this presentation and then meeting us tonight here over Zoom. So
Yeah,
we certainly do appreciate it.
yeah, thanks a lot. And my dog waited till the very end to bark, so that was good too.
Nicely done. Well, I guess while everybody's kind of logging off or leaving, I'll just remind everybody of our fungus event coming up October 24th at ECO. And then go buy a fishing license, everybody. Go buy a fishing license. All right. See you, Ethan.